All right, and we're good to go.
Well, I think I had sent around an email. I think we had just a couple of things to kind of clarify and formalize on the, but we're pretty much all the way there. And then we can kind of talk on the letter, unless people have other things they want to bring up first. All right, I will share my screen here in a moment. We'll do the, which one was it? Let me find it here. The qualifications. I think I just had one kind of follow-up question on this one. Let me share my screen here. All right, can y'all see that? Okay. So the first one is if I should just remove the line, if we should just remove the line about case managers and social workers, the kind of what the difference is in this opening paragraph, that social workers can do therapeutic services. It sounded like a couple of people did not think this was necessary. Does anyone think we should keep this line in? Great, let's remove it. And then the other piece was we had talked about in one of our meetings adding in a requirement around like sobriety for somebody in recovery or something of that nature. So this was based on our conversation, I added the highlighted portion here and just wanted to see what people thought, if we should change it, have a conversation or kind of what people think about it.
I will say, being a person in recovery, that to get prior to the law change, but to get a job in the recovery field, you have to have a minimum of 2 years from certain agencies. Now it used to be just the general standard. You can't get a CRM until you have 2 years clean, but they changed that. But I do think a minimum of 2 years, if not more, but at least a minimum of 2 years in recovery if they're going to be somebody with the lived experience of use.
Tara, what's the requirement for the CRM now?
There's no requirement now.
Okay. Same with your wellness specialist?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just
curious.
I will say unfortunately, because I think that for me, when I first got in recovery, it was like really something to look forward to. It was like something to drive for, something to stay sober for. And I will tell you, I would never hire somebody with 2 weeks of recovery, 6 months of recovery, because they don't even know what the heck is going on yet. I don't care how many times they've been in recovery. Like, you don't lose that recovery, but I think that it's important. I think a minimum of 2 years is very important. And that's just my opinion.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, it could be like a good stepping stone to start out as a CRM and then, be able to move into this type of role. I think there's a lot around kind of, in my experience, a lot around like boundaries that would be good to have the 2 years minimum.
Well, and I wonder too, what all of you think. Do you think 2 years is long enough, or should it be longer? I mean, and 2 years from what, I guess, and how is that determined? Because is it, I don't know. In theory, we could have someone who completed treatment like a year ago or something, but they've been in recovery for 2 years. I mean, I don't know. I guess it just depends on how we define that. And what would the client response be to, especially in smaller communities like we are? A lot of the peer support people that are contracted through other agencies, they know a lot of our clients based on having used with them or knowing of them. And sometimes that's beneficial and sometimes it's really not, depending on the situation.
Yeah, so if it's okay, I can kind of I mean, I would like to respond to some of that. So, I came into this role, I, so our standard here at MPD was 5 years minimum recovery. And it's in how it's worded and how I would probably recommend that it be worded is 5 years of documented sobriety, meaning meaning that like you would have to get like a letter from a treatment center, a sponsor, or somebody stating that they've known that you've been in recovery from this date, right? And it has to be minimum of 2 years from that date. And then like when I came into this, I also knew people, new clients from my drug use as well. And like you said, sometimes it's helpful and sometimes it's not. I'd say it's more likely helpful. And there has been like one situation where I was like, I'm not comfortable working with this person. And that's okay to say too. I feel like it's okay to say too. That kind of goes along with those boundaries. And so if you don't have that documented sobriety, and also sobriety does not mean recovery either. And so it's really hard to say, like, I've done step work, I've done the internal work for myself to be able to know what my boundaries are and be able to set those boundaries. Whereas somebody who's just, I mean, yeah, it's a tough one. So maybe 3 years of documented sobriety.
Yeah, Michaela.
Sorry. I like the 3 years of documented. What I can say, like doing this work, because of the attorney-client privilege, it's a lot more difficult to navigate around like getting support, especially if like a client is really triggering or is really, or you're needing to navigate like being in some kind of contact with someone that you've previously used with before. And so like the support looks a lot different for someone who's like more fresh in recovery. So because I say that because I've seen it happen, like with parent mentors and with um, like other professionals, even though the role's different. But so I definitely think the 3 years minimum of the documented sobriety would be really, really important because I feel like that first year is really just stabilizing. And so to have like a little bit more distance, just like from that stabilization period, would be important.
Yeah, Lee.
If our intention is for recovery to serve as lived experience and a substitute for any of the above qualifications, we're not making that clear with this bullet point. This bullet point makes it look like for anyone applying for either of these jobs, if they happen to be in recovery, they would need to be in recovery for 3 years. So if the intention is to say that being in recovery is like a lived experience that might compensate for not meeting the above requirements, it's not explicit in this bullet point.
So is that something, I guess what should we do with that? Is there a change we should make, or is it just more, we, in our position preferences, we do say, familiarity and or lived experience in the criminal and juvenile justice systems. We could also add comma, including, or like, in the recovery, something about recovery in there. Yeah, Melissa?
Would another, sorry, Melissa, would another
go ahead, Jordan.
or after the third bullet point clarify it, Lee?
Would another what?
The word or. So it's a bachelor's degree, a bachelor's degree, or a bachelor's degree, or a combination of equivalent experience and education, or lived experience. I don't know. I see what you're saying.
Could you Oh, go ahead, Lee.
I think we should just identify what we're trying to do with this bullet point about recovery and then fashion language around that.
Melissa, did you have something to add?
Well, so I guess I was looking at the ORs, also a combination of equivalent experience and education in related fields. And then it's not really clear. I mean, I think Lee's right about that. About and maybe it's a bachelor's degree for the first section, a bachelor's degree or higher level degree in social work, human services, or a closely related field, or, and then it like could be indented to include the next two bullet points. I don't know, that's just an idea so that it's clear that it's like those two things in combination instead of a bachelor's or higher level degree. And then for the applicant and recovery piece, I guess the question that is that separate, or are we still saying a bachelor's degree in a not closely related field, for example, or is that just like a separate standalone for all? Because if it's for all, then I think we just bump it back out and it's clear that any applicant in recovery must have this period of time and a reliable vehicle and driver's license and applicable insurance. Or is this like a vehicle, is the lived experience piece a vehicle to get around having a bachelor's degree or having a degree? I guess that's the bigger question.
Jordan?
Thanks. I think the answer to that is yes, the lived experience was intended to be a way around the degree requirements. So what if we bump back out the combination of equivalent experience and education, make a bullet point indented under that says lived experience in no, under the next one, sorry. Lived experience in the criminal court system may qualify as equivalent experience. That way we've specifically called it out. And then the question is, does the applicant in recovery prong apply to everybody or just people who are asking for equivalent experience?
I don't know why it wouldn't
about
apply to
that?
everybody, but Tara has her hand up there. Go ahead. You're muted though.
Sorry, I put my hand up prior to Jordan speaking, and I'm just looking at other agencies like peer agencies and how they word it, but I forgot to take my hand down. Sorry.
I was kind of doing the same
we
thing
like
just
their
to see
wording?
if there was like best practice around some language around this. I mean, I will say that I mean, I would agree that I think that the lived experience should be seen as like a like I can't remember who said what, but like if you don't have a bachelor's degree, the combination of lived experience would qualify you. And then, yeah, my other thought was just, is there language kind of along the lines of what Tara was doing? Is there best practice language around the documented sobriety piece?
So how about, to me, this line here, the lived experience, putting it here, that I, as we were talking, had put this line here. I wonder if it would make sense to delete this and have the bullet point under this one to say lived experience in these systems you know, kind of put this bullet point up there. And then
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
yeah, okay. And then to me, I think recovery, this work involves, if anybody is in recovery, they're going to be working with other people in recovery. So I think that this should apply across the board and not be called out only for persons with lived it. Like, I don't see a point for any distinction.
I totally agree with that. Yeah.
So just to throw this out there, there could be also, I guess, then are we limiting ourselves in the way that we are contracting with people that would otherwise be meet all of the qualification standards to do the work? Like, for example, as attorneys that do this work, we don't have to certify any of those things. Right?
Yeah, I haven't seen as the social worker positions that, ask social workers that identify as in recovery to then provide documented treatment records, et cetera.
I mean, I
think
guess
that would be
that's my
unusual.
concern, and that could be somewhat, I don't know. I guess I just worry about that. But I think that if you aren't like a social worker or you don't have the requisite degrees, that makes some sense and is defensible, right? About objectively defensible, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, Tara?
I will say, in order to get, in the past, when I first applied for my CRM, when they had the 2-year minimum requirement, you had to provide a document of my sobriety. So I had gotten a letter from my housing provider because I lived in clean and sober housing. I got a letter from the CEO or the person that runs it who said, I know Tara's been in recovery since this date. And that's not asking for treatment records. That's not asking for any HIPAA violation of any kind. It's just saying like a documented, sobriety, and maybe a bullet point underneath that documentation can include letters from treatment providers, housing providers, sponsors, etc.
What about the people that are meeting the qualifications in terms of the degrees and relevant experience and are qualifying for the position in that way and don't want to disclose that they're in recovery?
Then they're already meeting those requirements and they don't have to, I would say, because I've had that too. Like one of my good friends didn't have the clean time because she relapsed drinking, but she also has her MSW. And so she was going into more of a, not a case management field. She was going more into a program manager field. But I would say not everybody's going to disclose that they are. I've met attorneys who are in recovery, but they don't disclose that either.
Right. And I think that's, from my perspective, the exact issue is that if this is an exception to the general qualifications, and so because it's an exception, I think that it's more permissible to require because the person wouldn't otherwise, because if they otherwise met the qualification standard, they wouldn't have to be seeking an exception.
So let's wordsmith this and then we can kind of see if we all agree. So I'm thinking like basically making this, as you can see here, kind of a bullet point under that lived experience piece that says anyone using lived experience, maybe it would be like, I don't know the phrasing.
Maybe like applicants applying based on lived experience and actively in recovery require 3 years, something like that.
And
We could also say something along the lines of, if you openly identify as a person in recovery, we would, you must show, you know, a minimum of 3 years documented sobriety. And then maybe a bullet point, documented sobriety can be a letter from blah, blah, blah.
Getting annoyed with my computer here. Whatever, that's fine. Okay. Let me. Okay, what do people think about that idea from Tara? Do we want to add those in or kind of explain that a little bit more? Melissa?
So I guess I'm just asking for clarification. I'm sorry, my camera's off. I'm trying to eat lunch too. And since we're recording, I don't necessarily need the world to see that. But I just want to clarify, would that then be for everyone, that if they are outwardly in recovery? Because
So you're thinking we should remove,
I mean, I
this
think
part.
it's,
Anyone
I mean, I think it's
applying
fine there, that if people are applying based on that that combination of lived experience and education, as opposed to just meeting the other requirements, that I think that my personal opinion is that that's when it should apply, but that it shouldn't just across the board apply to people that are in recovery. Because I feel like that's pretty invasive.
Well, I think
to
that's
require
what,
someone.
Yeah, well, I think our intention is to have this apply to the lived experience only.
Well, that's what I was
trying
to clarify, because I wasn't
Yes.
super clear about that. Okay.
Yeah, so but we need that to be clear. So that's why the language applicants applying based on lived experience. But
Should we take out
but if they don't
education?
have, but they need something about recovery, because not everybody with lived experience is in recovery. Sorry, Tara, what'd you say?
I'm so sorry. Is the confusion coming from a combination of equivalent experience and education in related fields? So no, because that, and then lived experience, sorry.
Yeah, Melissa, sorry, maybe you can help us understand what, it sounds like this is not clear to you how it's structured here.
Well, I thought
right?
that I think I wasn't understanding Tara's comment.
I see.
Previously.
You were saying in response to Tara with the kind of that how you would demonstrate this with like letters.
Right. So could you, instead of saying documented minimum 3 years documented sobriety, could you say minimum 3 years documented recovery? Is that what we're looking for? Or must the person be in recovery with 3 years of documented sobriety?
So to respond, I think this might help. So if you have lived experience in the criminal, like lived experience, the way that I would define that, and I could be wrong, is somebody who has been a person who has been arrested, dealt with DHS themselves, like been a parent who's lost their children, been a person who's used drugs or alcohol as opposed like to an extent of it affecting their lives in the criminal justice system. And so if you are a person with lived experience, I would say that you either struggle with mental health or use of drugs and alcohol. And so I think that that's why it's just really important to say documented sobriety but I think that's why this is important. Does that help answer your question?
I fully agree that it's important. I think I was just misunderstanding what you were suggesting about to whom it should apply.
Okay. For the people specifically who are applying with just the lived experience, no educational piece, no, like I don't have a bachelor's. I don't, I have a GED and I've been going to college. So like that's
no, and that's, I mean, I have people that we work with regularly that have that experience, and frankly, they're fantastic.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't want them to be excluded. But yeah, it's interesting though, because I think you could potentially, like, if depending on what your lived experience is in the criminal and juvenile justice system, you may or may not be in recovery. And so, I mean, if an applicant is like in recovery or, you know, has had a substance use issue, we would want them to be in recovery. I don't know. I just think we're probably going down a rabbit hole now.
Lee, go ahead.
Annie, I like the way that you've indented this. My take on it and my understanding from when we started talking about this is that lived experience can substitute for some of like the educational requirements, and one subset of lived experience is recovery. I think you can get to lived experience in the system in other ways, like having a family member or a child who's entangled in the criminal justice system. I don't think I don't know that you need to have a substance abuse issue to have lived experience. So I think as long as we make it clear that, you know, lived experience can substitute for some of the above requirements. And then furthermore, if your lived experience is recovery, we'd prefer that you have 3 years of documented sobriety, recovery, whatever you want to say. I think that would make it clear.
All right, Tara, go ahead.
As I reread this too, Lee, and correct me if it says applicants applying based on lived experience in recovery must have a minimum. So I think that's what I think it's worded exactly the way we're trying to get. I think we're just, yeah.
I just added that, so hopefully.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and then I'll take out this part. That was just a note to myself. All right, so any other thoughts on this? Does this seem, I'm gonna remove this highlight because that's all. How does this sound to everybody? Oh, Dana, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, so I was looking at for certified recovery mentor, I like the language around that was just crafted around that. But as far as the CRMs or peer wellness specialists, I looked it up and they do have to pass a criminal history background check. And I just wondered, like, if anyone knows what that background check looks, you know, because many people with that lived experience are going to have a criminal background. And yeah, go ahead, Tara, if you know the answer.
Yeah. So I am a felon. I have a Class A felony. Prior to Senate Bill 819, it was not expungible. Really what it is you know, get your, it's just a background check. I think there are, like, you can even have sex offenses and arsons. I think it's just, you can't be on active probation to get that. I think, I could be wrong. And it's not like, I don't think that anybody gets to that. I know people who have murder, you know, manslaughter murders on their records have gotten CRMs. I'm not exactly sure why they do them. But I do know that, like, not very many people get denied.
And I think that's also why we had the language of other certificates or programs that offer similar training around peer support may meet this criteria, so that if there are other avenues to get there. All right, any other thoughts on this? Are we good to go? Anyone? Melissa, go ahead.
So I was going to try and open the document again, but did we include somewhere about the requirement to be able to, like, go into jails and prisons, things like that? Because as I was just listening to Tara about sex offenses and things like that, that could be problematic, especially.
We put in there as a position preference as ability to access jails and other secure facilities, with some exceptions possible for lived experience, to kind of key this to be as a part of a requirement, because if it's something related to an expungible offense that they would be able to access, we wouldn't want to limit those people. And that's why the exceptions, you know. I mean,
Okay.
I guess we could move that up to the qualification standards and out of the
Well,
position
and
preferences.
is there a background check that like people would have to go through in general for this if they were a contractor, for example?
We did not, that's actually something we should talk about. So our PCRP case managers do go through a background check. And so I don't know if we put that, if we add that to this anywhere here. You know, part of me is thinking, if this is somebody who is applying for a position, the background check would be part of the application process and not necessarily a part of a qualification. But if this is something where to qualify to be this position under the PAE system, what about in that situation? So I'll throw that back out to the group. Any thoughts on if we should include anything about, I don't know that we use the word pass, but you know, the person must submit to a background check or something along those lines?
I think submit to, like willing to. Yeah,
I agree with that. Their consent to, yeah.
I mean, especially like well, it should be in every case, I guess,
Yes.
but
Yeah.
particularly in juvenile, like if you're doing this work, I would not likely utilize it. It would just be a huge liability, especially for attorneys who these people, you know, we essentially are responsible for the things that happen and their work as our agent. And so that would be quite concerning.
So I think we just come back, the issue with this language, right? The only issue here, or not the only issue, the issue is to make it not limiting.
Right, but just submit to.
Scare people away, which is, so is this clear enough? Do you think we're okay with just saying submit to a background check? Not pass? Is that good enough, or do we want to put any other language around that? All right, any other?
If they
Okay.
can't pass a background check, they're gonna have a really, really hard time. Like, I'm just thinking, like, in the juvenile side, they can't get into the schools to see clients, they can't get into the jails. Attorneys are gonna feel uncomfortable. Like, if they can't pass a background check, that's gonna create a lot of barriers, and then
Well, I think, you know,
go ahead.
well, but I think that's the point, is that is like, how do we kind of work around some of the things on background checks though are removable to allow you to be able to do those things, or kind of have access. Jordan, go ahead.
I was just going to say, for whatever it's worth, I think some of this that we're talking about is also baked into some of the other qualifications that we've been working on. So like, I know the bar requires a background check. I think the investigator, mitigator standards are going to require DPSST certification, which is similar. So I don't know that asking people to submit to a background check is going to be out there when we're talking about standards. I think it's going to be fairly routine for all the positions.
Yeah, Becca?
I was just gonna say, so we can kind of leave the door open on it, if we can just put something about it being on a case by case basis, because if we're looking at, say, someone in recovery with lived experience 3 years, it's quite possible that being involved in the criminal justice system and getting arrested, having a felony, having a charge is what led them into getting sober or being in recovery and going to treatment, et cetera. So are we able to just add something about on a case by case and kind of evaluate if there were applicants in that position?
So I think we're kind of conflating two things, because it's submit versus passing. So we don't say anything about passing here. We're just saying submit to. And then in my mind, that kind of adds that language of that as part of the conversation. Yeah, or something along those lines. Dana?
No, that's just what I was gonna say. I feel very strongly about submitting to a background check. I don't think it needs to say pass because I think that, you know, like what folks are saying, that's on a case by case basis, but I do feel strongly about the background check.
So are we good on just saying submit to a background check? All right. Any other comments on this document, or can we put it as passed and submit it to the agency internally? Yay, awesome. All right, that's enough for me. Good job, team. And let's turn quickly to performance standards, which I think there were only, oh, go ahead, Tara.
I just put in the chat, I was totally wrong. There are some exclusions to the background checks for CRM, but I just put a link in the chat if anybody wants to look at it.
Oh, cool, thank you.
And I don't think we need to do it here, but yeah, we might want, it might be helpful for folks if they're hiring these people to have some guidance on how to like analyze a background check. You know, like what are we looking at when we get a background check, and what would be offenses that would, you know, preclude them from being hired. I don't think we need to do that today, but
Yeah, I think that is a future thing that we should talk about. I mean, I think there's a lot of things about the training and the other kind of structures that we're building that may or may not be built in, that would be the place to discuss this. But thank you, Tara. That's very, you guys are good at the Google and the finding of the things. All right, on this performance standards, I think, let's see. Oh, this was on the, I feel like this comment was not supposed to be here. It was supposed to be on the conflict of the conflict of interest. Basically, initially we said that the attorney would have final say, and then like thinking through, that might put a social worker with a license in a precarious position. And so it may be that I don't know, I'm guessing this is Dana, but the kind of saying they have a conversation, understanding about kind of the work, or something along the lines that it's a discussion so people know their, you know, responsibilities moving forward. So any thoughts on adopting this language, putting something else in? Dana, you look poised to say something.
clarify. I was clear, like I thought that this comment was related to mandatory reporting. So that's what
Yes,
my
that's what I meant.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, I said conflict
Okay.
of interest. I was trying to find where it was supposed to be.
Okay.
Yes. What do people think on this? Melissa, you look like you're about to say something since no one's raising their hand.
I mean, I think that ultimately it should be the decision of the attorney, but if it really does put a licensed social worker in a difficult situation, I thought there were exceptions to that, though, if I recalled correctly, based on the standards and the guidance.
OPDC has produced guidance that believes social workers have exceptions when working under this. However, that is not, I mean, I guess that maybe is, if we are adopting, we could just reference that memo here, and someone working in this position would enter this knowing that they are, you know, okay with that document and reading of kind of the situation.
I mean, there are times when, I mean, there are certain situations that even for attorneys, it's not a shall, but a may, right? Like, so, you may disclose in certain situations, but it's very rare, the circumstance arising where you haven't, you should be taking some sort of affirmative step. But I don't know. I think one of the hugely important pieces to case managers is that confidentiality of information, and that anything, and like I tell my clients, the same privilege that applies with me applies with the case manager when they're working for me. And so I worry that that if it doesn't say that that they have to confer with the attorney and that ultimately the attorney makes the decision, I worry that it will cause more issues.
Yeah, Tara?
I agree with Melissa. I think that it needs to state something about ultimately attorney makes the decision. There have been times in my office, even when it comes to like calling like I had a client, was gonna jump off at one of the bridges here in Portland. Somebody walked them to my office. One of the social workers here wanted to, get them help through calling somebody, and we couldn't do it because it's essentially like a mandatory report situation where, or not essentially mandatory, but it was a situation that like could have gone against if they didn't want to go to the hospital, if they would have said no to the ambulance or something. And so like there can be times where it's very conflicting for our own what we were taught through education and through taking our certifications and just kind of like, I want to get this person help, but we just can't. And so, yeah, I think it's very important to state that it needs to go back to the attorney. And yeah.
I will say though, as a social worker, it would be so much more comforting to know that the Board of Licensed Social Workers was in agreement with that. Whereas if we're just taking directions, say from OPDC saying these are the guidelines from a different organization, I am curious to see what the Board of Licensed Social Workers would say about that and if we'd all be in agreement, because at the end of the day, they're the ones that decide what happens with the license. So I don't know if there's some protection there or what, but it's definitely been on my mind since I've started here, so.
So I think we're at a bit of a difficult point on this because I think I agree it makes sense that we need to get clarification from the social work board. We're not going to get that on the timeline that we need it here. So I think the question is, do people entering these roles, right? This is still a conversation with the attorney. So that still allows room for an office or an attorney or the social worker. Like it kind of pings for the conversation to happen. And it may be that we include the language that Dana put in here, kind of saying there needs to be an understanding prior to the onset of work. Well, like if somebody has a license, that needs to be a conversation between the attorney and the social worker because the attorney has the final say on the reporting things. So not changing that but paying, like noting that it needs to be the conversation. And we can also, which I started to write here, say, see and reference the PCRP manual or something that gets to the document that the agency put out regarding reporting social workers and reporting. How do people feel about kind of those ideas?
And if people really feel like we need guidance from some other agency or agencies, we may be able to submit the position definition and the qualification standards and have additional time on the performance standards piece if there's something outstanding that we really need to work on.
So it would seem like, just in general, if that's an issue, that's something that should occur regardless of what we say about this, because that's already an issue for folks that are providing this service.
So I can't, my like raise hand button is broken. So I'm sorry. I mean, I can say that I had a case recently where I did have to consult like with the most bare information that one could possibly give. Um, to like make that ethics call, and because like I really like a report needed to be made and the attorney said no, and like 100% the attorney needs to have the final say in that. But I was really, really worried that my license was at risk on this particular case because of the inability to like provide that information. And the board just said like you have to get off the case. So I think if we don't get the board's like opinion on this, I do think for the licensed people, what we're gonna see is like there needs to be an option that then we have to get off the case if it rises to a particular level that it could jeopardize our license, which is a situation of a case that I very recently had and then needed to get off because of the license risk of it. So I do think we need to bring in the social work board for like an opinion, or maybe, I don't think it needs to go in here, but I think a conversation later is like, hey, the social worker needs to be able to make a final decision about conflicting off a case or getting off a case if they have a concern about their license being in jeopardy, and then that needs to like be okay to do, if that makes any sense.
Dana, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna agree with Michaela. I mean, I think attorneys need need to be aware that if they're working with a licensed social worker, that there may be a requirement to report based on their license. And so when and it has come up for us. And so I think that in those situations, like I put here, I mean, the attorney consulted with the bar, the social worker consulted with the board of licensed social workers, and, a decision was made. And in that case, in a case, it might be like Michaela's situation where she has to get off the case, or, the report is made and it's documented on why it was made. But looking across in different states, this is definitely an issue.
And so like I didn't have to make a report, but how we like the best plan we could come up with to protect my license was I get off the case and I email the attorney my concerns and say, I'm just clarifying, our understanding is that a hotline call will not be made. And then like I attached I forget what agency put out the thing that Dana sent out.
NAPD.
Yeah, like I attached that. And so like I documented everything in a private email to the attorney, and the attorney's like, confirming we are not calling the hotline. And I'm like, great. So that responsibility is off me. And then I conflicted off the case, and the board felt like that was the best resolution. And so I didn't have to call the hotline. I feel crappy about it, but I didn't. So I still protected everything in this job, and also protected my license at the same time. So I think just attorneys being aware that there might be situations where if they're working with someone that is licensed, um, that there is a chance they might have to conflict off and then not, you know, further have anything to do with a case that, in that situation that happens.
So, Annie, could I suggest that this is a conversation that I think needs to continue, maybe not in this context, but that warrants further discussion because it presents current issues for providers and case managers that we need to kind of work on, I think.
Sure. I don't disagree. I think so. The way that I think we can take this up with general counsel in our office and kind of create a conversation. And basically, I think we need to just reach out to the board to kind of get a clarifying letter or something along those lines. So I think we need to somehow note this in these standards. It may be that we can put a piece in our letter as well, or our memo, to kind of deal with that. But I still think we need something here on the,
Could we say like generally the attorney makes the final decision regarding reporting of child abuse? However, when the case manager is a licensed social worker, there may be additional considerations or something like that.
How about I'll spell this out. If I think then we put in the language that they must staff it. They must staff the case or something. And seek guidance from the Oregon State Bar and the Board of Licensed Social Workers or something along those lines.
Or may staff, I mean, because depending on what it is, they may or may not.
If they're talking about reporting, going out and reporting a conflict, I think they need to staff that. Or reporting a something that they feel mandatory report, I think they need to staff that.
What about language that says something to the effect of if the social worker disagrees, they can staff with X board for future follow-up or something like that?
They must staff with like an administrator with OPDC and potentially seek guidance from OSB and BLSW.
Yeah, except I think instead of LCSW, we should use SWCM to be consistent.
Yeah, except that case managers aren't mandatory. I think, or maybe just say if a managed social worker that is a mandatory reporter. Because this only applies to somebody who's a mandatory reporter.
When
Well,
you
we
get a
use
CRM,
SWCM at the top of the same standard too. Just
I think
whatever
it's
we do, we should just be
specific,
consistent throughout the
but
standard.
I think it's specific to a licensed clinical social worker who holds that separate license, as opposed to a case manager who doesn't have that same licensure requirement.
I'm a case manager and based on my CRM, I am a mandatory reporter.
And I think there are other licensed professionals that would be mandatory reporters as well, not just the LCSW.
But we're getting
think-
way outside though the scope then, because if we go into that, then any professional that I were to hire, like a nurse, for example, who's reviewing information and then something new is disclosed to them, by that reading, then they may be able to disclose or make a hotline call. That's a problem. That eliminates privilege. And yeah, I think we're getting way outside of where we need to be for this.
I think I agree with Melissa, and it's really not hard to be a mandatory reporter. I mean, you volunteer at your kid's school, you're considered a mandatory reporter, so it would like really then kind of pretty much apply to most everyone. I think the people that hold licenses, that liability, the expectation and the liability is really difficult, or is like much higher. And also we have like the ability to have like a really pissed off parent file complaints on our licenses too. Like if we don't do, what they feel we should do, or school personnel or whatever, which I've had happen, not to me, but to others. And
Well-
I just had a question really quick. I see that we're like putting child abuse reporting. Are we keeping it child abuse specific, or is this like vulnerable population reporting? Because I know we're required, like, if I have a client with disability that I believe is like being abused by a partner, I'm technically required to report that. So, and I know we work with lots of adults. So do we want to say like maybe like vulnerable populations, or kind of change that language away from just specifically child abuse?
I think we can
And I
work
will
in
say in
the
my-
same mandatory reporting language that we use to name the standard for it.
So vulnerable people or mandatory reporting?
I think we should stick to mandatory reporting so we don't open up a question of what, you know, what a vulnerable person might be. We can figure out the grammar for that.
I think we should, yeah, and include in the
And-
letter a strong recommendation to consult with the BLSW. And we'll bring that up the chain here internally as well. But what about this language here? How are we feeling about this?
Can you move the cursor? I see.
Jordan.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Bigger too.
I think that's fine. I mean,
Sorry, I'm realizing I might have another point. Do we have any, do we want to reference the memo or anything in here? Or,
I don't
yeah, let's hold off on that.
think we do.
We'll work to get guidance and then we can add in guidance to future documents if we get it from. It is almost 1 o'clock, so if anyone needs to leave, please go ahead, but I think we're pretty close. Is there any other conversations that need to happen around this document? How are people feeling?
I guess my thought is until we get some more clarification, should we stop it at the statutory citation and take out the attorney makes the final decision, since we don't really have a final answer yet? And if in either
I think
way, go ahead.
Sorry. One of the concerns with that is because we do have people actively doing this work, I think we want to be pretty careful. I will say in terms of a timeline right now, the performance standards are on a slower timeline. So the qualifications are going to be brought forward relatively soon, but the qualification standards are going to continue to be, you know, kind of a process, a work in process. And so I think that we just highlight that this is an area that is like needs an opinion from BLSW to clarify some of this before they get published, ideally. And if we don't get to that point, then we come back and figure out the formalized thing. Does that seem reasonable? Okay.
Yeah. I got to run to court, so I guess my last question is going to be when should I drop a draft of the letter to the commission into our folder? Do you guys want that like today? Would end of the week be okay?
So,
we've got an internal deadline of May 8th to get these submitted to our supervisory chain, which will then trickle them up to the commission. So if we want timely to review your letter before we submit it, can you get it by the end of the week? That gives, not including the weekend, that gives us 2 days to kind of look through it and group change it if we need to.
Yep, that's totally fine. And should the letter, is the letter going to address both the qualifications and the performance standards, or just one and not the other? I feel like it should address both.
I
I think
think that's a
it
group
should-
decision, but if you want to address
Yeah.
both, I see no reason not to address both.
I would say address both, but focus on the qualification standards if you're time crunched, because the performance standards can be handled later. That can be continued to be edited, or potentially other information could be brought forward. And I think thinking of it more as a memo instead of maybe a letter, in terms of kind of this stuff, I think would be helpful too. I can also start a document and people can just put if people have ideas that they think should be included, why don't we just have a running list of kind of areas to include so that Lee has some help in thinking through this stuff while he's drafting. That seem good?
Sounds good.
Awesome. Thanks, Lee.
All right, I'm heading to court. Thanks, guys.
Yeah. Anyone else have anything else to say on this stuff?
Yeah. I have to get to another meeting, so I'm gonna hop
Awesome.
off. Thanks.
Thanks, Melissa. All right. I think we're probably good. Excellent work. Good job, guys. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.